Hello, my name is James Armstrong and I am a teacher of politics, and in this video I'm going to be talking about the 2005 general election in the UK. Now this is a general election that not many people talk about. I think that's a shame because I think it's an interesting election for a variety of different reasons which I'll go into. It is an election that Labour win. They win a majority of 66. It's an election they're expecting to win. But perhaps what's notable about this election, what lots of you will know about this election, is that it's an election where Labour win a majority with only 35.2% of the vote. Now that is the lowest percentage of the vote ever that leads to a majority, and if we're thinking about criticisms of the first past the post system, it's quite a major criticism of the first past the post system that a government can get a majority of 66 seats. In other words, a majority that's going to enable them to govern very securely. They're going to be a very strong and stable government that are going to be able to pass law, even though just over a third of people vote for them. It's not a very strong position. So they win what's called a plurality of the vote, sometimes called a simple majority. They win the most votes, but nowhere near a majority of votes. Now, of course, under first past the post, it's very, very unusual for the winning party to win a majority. In fact, if you discount the national government in the 1930s, it's been 120 years since a government won a majority of the vote. A single party government, that is. But still, it's quite shocking, really, looking back, that a government was able to win a majority of this size, having only won 35.2% of the vote. So that's what happens. I want to start by talking about the context. Now, the most important thing to say about the context, I think, is that Blair wins in 2001, and then towards the end of the year, in September, 9/11 happens. And so I was in sixth form at the time. I remember being on the way home. A friend had given me a lift back home, and as I was in the car, I heard that a plane had hit the World Trade Center in New York. When I got home and I switched on the television, that was all that had happened, and then we all watched live as a second plane hit the second tower. And it's at that moment we realized that this wasn't an accident, that America was under attack. A third plane hit the Pentagon, and a fourth plane was brought down as it was heading towards Washington. So that event, the biggest attack on America in its history on the mainland, it started something that became known as the War on Terror. So America went after the Taliban in Afghanistan, and that set in train a war that lasted, it's actually only just coming to the end as I record this video. Joe Biden has only just announced that troops will be withdrawing finally this year, a 20-year conflict in Afghanistan. And importantly for this election, Tony Blair, along with George W. Bush, agrees to commit troops to war in Iraq. And just to give you a little bit of background here, the argument in this war centered around the question of weapons of mass destruction. And Blair put together a dossier of evidence that suggested that Saddam Hussein still had stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction. And there was a central claim in that dossier that Saddam Hussein had the capacity to launch weapons of mass destruction against our allies within 45 minutes. And that became known as the 45-minute claim. And that led to a lot of controversy. And in particular, a whistleblower called Dr. David Kelly, he went to a reporter called Andrew Gilligan at Radio 4, and he said that this claim was false. There was a public inquiry into this. David Kelly was brought before a select committee of the House of Commons and questioned about it, and 2 days later he was found dead. So it was a really horrible episode in our political history. But this issue of Iraq becomes central and it becomes quite toxic for Blair in particular and for the Labour Party in general. About 1 million people, somewhere between 500,000 and 2 million people marched through the streets in protest against the Iraq war as part of the Stop the War coalition, with prominent left-wing MPs like Jeremy Corbyn joining that Stop the War movement. And the Liberal Democrats under Charles Kennedy opposed the war. And so this is a huge event, and there's lots of controversy surrounding it. Many people feel like we went to war under a pretext that was false, that the government sexed up this dossier, that the government essentially lied about their reason for going to war. Lots of people with placards being held up saying, "No war for oil, not in my name." And this really damages Tony Blair. And one of the prominent things that we do see in this election, well, first of all, the Liberal Democrats get their best result ever under Charles Kennedy, and that's partly because he opposed the war, whereas both the Labour Party under Tony Blair and the Conservative Party at the time under Ian Duncan Smith supported the war. And what also happens is that anti-war MPs, or personalities I should say, becomes an MP. George Galloway, he wins a seat in Bethnal, Bore and Green in this election. He's a firebrand left-wing politician. George Galloway, a very controversial politician, wins a seat in this election. Okay, so that's some of the context for the Conservative Party. In 2001, they elect Ian Duncan Smith to be leader of the party. To say the least, it doesn't go very well. His leadership is regarded as being weak, and he's seen as somebody that really doesn't have the personality or the charisma to be leading a major political party. And the Tories, ruthless as ever, get rid of Ian Duncan Smith and replace him with Michael Howard. Michael Howard is an experienced pair of hands, but he's also somebody that had been a minister under John Major, and therefore it was quite easy for Labour to paint Michael Howard as somebody that was a typical Tory. And so, it works in favour of them to some extent because Howard is a safe pair of hands, but Labour are able to say it's the same old Tories, it's the same old nasty party. And there's a famous quote about Michael Howard by Anne Widdecombe, that there's something of the night about him. Another thing to note in terms of context is that going into this election, Blair essentially says that he'll step down in the middle of his third term, that he won't run for a fourth term. And so voters are aware of this. They're aware that if they vote for a Labour government, they're going to get Blair. But essentially they're going to end up with a new leader, probably Gordon Brown, going into this election. So what does the campaign look like? Well, Labour campaign on their record. They're obviously trying to avoid the issue of Iraq. And what they want to be able to say is that they have a strong record in government. By this point, Labour have increased taxes to properly fund the National Health Service. They've presided over a long period of economic growth since 1997. But to some extent, their campaign is overshadowed by Iraq. And Labour are going to be worried by the presence of the Liberal Democrats in this campaign, because Charles Kennedy's Liberal Democrats, well, they opposed the war, and they're also trying to appeal to voters on Labour's left, particularly younger voters, by promising to abolish tuition fees, a position actually that the Conservative Party also have at this election. Michael Howard, leading the Conservative Party, keeps the party on the right, and there's a famous election poster at this election by the Conservative Party that says it's not racist to impose limits on immigration, and that suggests the sort of the tone that is being adopted in this campaign by the Conservative Party. And meanwhile, the Labour Party are keen to emphasise that it's the same old Tories, and that if there's a vote for the Conservative Party, it's going to take the country back to the bad old days. The media at this election is split. Labour lose the Express newspaper, but keep the backing of both The Sun and The Times. The Independent backs the Lib Dems, and The Guardian says either vote Lib Dem or vote Labour, and of course the Daily Mirror still backs Labour. So there's a little bit of change in terms of the media landscape, but what's critical in this election is that Labour retain the support of the Murdoch empire, The Times and The Sun, and so they're not facing the barrage of criticism that would usually be hurled against left-wing leaders of the Labour Party that we famously saw with Jeremy Corbyn in both 2017 and 2019. So, what happens? Well, Labour win, as I've said, with 35.2% of the vote. They managed to get a majority of 66. It is a good election for the Liberal Democrats. They increased their number of seats by 10, winning 62 seats in total and winning almost 6 million votes. And so there seems to be an election where the Labour Party lose votes to their left, to the Liberal Democrats. The Conservatives do only slightly better, really, winning 32.4% of the vote. And so it's not a great election for them. And I guess if you're going to think of what's going on in this election, you would say, well, Labour have a very strong record in office. There's no particular reason, aside from the Iraq War, why you would vote against them. And the Conservative Party really are still projecting this sense that they're a party of the right. Michael Howard feels like a bit of a stopgap leader. He's keeping the party on the right. And so he's still pursuing the kind of core vote strategy that didn't work for them in 2001 under William Hague. They're not reaching out to the centre ground. He hasn't modernised the party. And so the sort of mainstream view of this election is that essentially Labour don't lose the election because they retain their economic and political competence, and the Conservative Party can't capitalise on Labour's failings, partly because they haven't modernised the party enough, but partly also because the key failing of Labour in this time is the Iraq War, and the Tories had supported that. And also you might say that something like an overseas war that's unpopular is not a domestic issue, and so it's never going to be that salient when people are voting in a general election. The salient issue, the most prominent issue, is likely to be something like the economy, the National Health Service, education, and it's really, really unlikely to be the war in Iraq, however much it might matter in the broader scheme of things. What else could be going on at this election? It's worth sort of thinking about alternative hypotheses. Well, there was quite a low turnout at the election. I think that's worth noting. We'd already said that in 2001, the turnout had dipped by about 12%. Well, turnout recovers slightly. It's up 2%, but only 61.4% of people voted this election. And so there's a hollowing out of Labour's electoral coalition at this election. First of all, there are people that went from, in 1997, they voted, and there are around 10% of those now not voting, so quite a large number of people have just dropped out of the electorate. And in addition to that, Labour's vote is down 5.5%. They're down to 35.2% of the vote. And so, whilst they win a majority of 66, there might be a bit of complacency creeping into the Labour Party at this point, because it's not a good result. It's a result where they're lucky to win a majority of 66, because historically 35.2% is just not enough to win a majority. And so what's really going on here is that their vote is being used really efficiently. And you can see this if you look at England. Actually, the Conservative Party, if you just look at England, win more votes than the Labour Party. And yet in England, the Labour Party win 90 more seats than the Conservative Party. So there's something a little bit odd going on here. The Conservative vote is just not being used very efficiently at this election. As I said, the Tories tried a core vote strategy in 2 elections and it didn't work. So there's an argument here for more modernisation. The Conservative Party are still regarded in this election as the nasty party, and it's going to take the leadership of a young, more dynamic David Cameron to modernise the party. It's the best ever result for the Lib Dems, and I've already mentioned Blair's credibility is fundamentally damaged by Iraq. Now, next time I'm going to talk about the 2010 election. Worth noting here this hollowing out of support for Labour in 2005, because I think by the time we get to 2010, we know that Labour lose that election, but the sort of lazy answer that you get about 2010 is it's all about the financial crisis, which of course it is, but one of the sort of longer term things that people forget is that that Labour's electoral coalition had been significantly hollowed out in 2005. So if you're going to take anything away from this election, there's one central message, which is this is a very, very low level of support for Labour. It's the lowest level of support that ever wins a majority. And that matters by the time you get to the next election, because Labour are starting at a very low level. More about that next time.